So that's how we start. Daniel recaps the dream, and now he's ready to interpret the dream. Let's read verses 37 through 45. You, O king, the King of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, and the might, and the glory, and into whose hand he has given, wherever they dwell, the children of man, the beasts of the field, and the birds of the heavens, making you rule over them all. You are the head of gold. Another kingdom inferior to you shall arise after you, and yet a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. And there shall be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, because iron breaks to pieces and shatters all things. And like iron that crushes, it shall break and crush all these. And as you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, it shall be a divided kingdom. But some of the firmness of iron shall be in it, just as you saw iron mixed with the soft clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly iron and partly clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly brittle. And as you saw the iron mixed with soft clay, so they will mix with one another in marriage, but they will not hold together, just as iron does not mix with the clay. I'm going to continue. 2 more verses, sorry. And in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break into pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. Just as you saw that a stone was cut from a mountain by no human hand, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, a great God has made known to the king what shall be after this. The dream is certain, and its interpretation sure. So Daniel now has repeated the dream. Now he's interpreting the dream. We saw earlier that the content came from God. Now we see that the interpretation was given by God. And Daniel, right away, the first thing that he does is he points to God first. He says, the God of heaven has given you kingdoms, powers, the might, the glory. He's even given into your hands all of the children of man, all of these things, the beasts of the field. The reason that you have any authority or power as king is because of God. Can you imagine standing in the face of a ruthless ruler who is said to have the most centralized power of any kingdom ever, and looking at him and saying, you're nothing without God? But Daniel didn't exactly say that, right? He told him the truth, but he did it in a way that God wanted him to do it, with care, with love. He didn't look at Nebuchadnezzar and say, you got nothing. Some of us might do that when we deliver the truth. But what we're learning today is that the delivery of the truth can affect its message. Daniel knows that. And he starts by pointing to God, saying, I'm giving God all of the glory. You should give God all of the glory too, because everything that you are and have is because of him. You see, it didn't matter what the facts of the prophecy were if he was just going to deliver them as facts and not point to God. The bigger picture here was that God is glorified, not that facts were revealed. That's the purpose. And so all of this matters because Daniel was faithful to glorify God in his message, and he starts by pointing to God. So when we get caught in emotion or circumstances or fear, and we like to elevate ourselves or we want to protect ourselves, and then we start to compromise the message of the truth, that's not what Daniel does. Daniel stands firm on the truth, and he points to God first. And then he goes into explaining the statue we saw. What we see here, and I'm not going to get into a lot of the history because we don't have the time for that, but what we see here in this statue is 4 world powers identified. We see that Nebuchadnezzar is told in verse 38 as being the head of gold. That particular head of gold represents Babylon. We can look back now on history and we can identify basically who the 4 world powers were. But we see specifically that King Nebuchadnezzar is the head of gold. Daniel tells him that. That represents Babylon. The next kingdom is represented by silver. We believe that that is Medo-Persia, another world power. Verse 39, we see yet another kingdom represented by bronze, or your translation may say brass. That's Greece, a world power. We see a fourth world power or kingdom that was represented by iron. That's Rome. We also see iron mixed with clay, which most likely represents the rising once again of the world power of the Roman Empire. The Antichrist is going to come and try to bring unity and life to this world power. You see, the Roman Empire didn't die. It wasn't killed by anyone. It wasn't defeated. It fell apart. There's not a fifth kingdom, which is, again, the Roman Empire. It's the revival of the fourth one that we see here. But if you notice something interesting about the statue, it starts with a pure head of gold, one head, unity, gold. What great value. But then as we see the progression of that statue described down to its feet, we see a lessening of value of each of the metals, each of its components. We see a division. What started as one head now goes to shoulders, into 2 arms, down into 2 legs, down into 10 toes. And we see not an increase in value or an attempt to get more unity. What we see here is that man's kingdoms are progressing to be less and less valuable and more divided. That's the representation here of the statue. History tells us and it shows us that man is not doing a better and better job of ruling and becoming more unified. We're becoming more and more disunified. And this statue shows us what we already know from history. If you happen to believe evolution, this is a real flaw in the whole concept of evolution. Things are not growing closer and closer to perfection. They're breaking down more and more. We see the same with anything that man creates. Man's kingdom that starts with this value of power, a gold head, I am united, and then the more man tries, the more man becomes at each other, disunified. But then what we see is that what started as gold becomes dust. Human kingdoms are going to fall. They're going to fail. But what we wait is the eternal kingdom of God as represented by the stone. And so in verses 44 and 45, Daniel describes this stone that was made. Not from a human hand. It was not the work of man. The other 4 things of the statue, those kingdoms, were works of man as kingdoms on earth. But this stone that's going to come destroy all of those man-made things and finally be the one stone that becomes a mountain over the entire earth, never to be destroyed, that stone, Daniel explains. Daniel again tells us who's responsible. He says, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. Who's responsible for that stone? It's not a human hand, remember, that created that stone. Daniel tells us it's the God of heaven who is setting up his kingdom, that mountain that takes up the entire earth. You see, God's judgment is final. When God declares it to be done, it's done. There's no wrestling with God. There's no compromising with God. This is his world, his plan, and his outcome, which is why Jesus Christ is such a gift. Jesus Christ gives us the ability to be part of God's plan, not in judgment, but as heirs, benefiting from God's kingdom. We get to be part of that kingdom. We get to be part of that plan. You see, the stone is not of man, but from God, and it represents Jesus. This is not an appointed man who's going to rise up with an army that's going to take over the world. This is God himself in the person of Jesus Christ, bringing about his eternal kingdom. And verse 44 tells us, a kingdom that will never be destroyed. As man wants to be unified, but is failing more and more, what we see is that God is the one who is going to make unity possible in his eternal kingdom. Daniel continues by explaining and redirecting the attention once again, not to his own wisdom about this dream, but about God and who is the one in control. Look at verse 45, the second half of it. Daniel says, a great God has made this known. How many times do we get in a situation where someone asks us for wisdom, and maybe we're clicking on all cylinders that day and we give them some great advice, right? Are we quick like Daniel to say, a great God has made that known to me? It's by God's guidance that I even have anything to say to you. That's how great our God is. And Daniel explains who the one in control is. He even goes as far as to say God's plan is certain. He uses the word, and he says that God's wisdom is sure. The end of this statement that I read is not Daniel being prideful when he says, this dream is certain and its interpretation sure. He's not standing up there like a statue and saying, this is me. I know what I said is the greatest thing ever. No, he's saying, I know that because it came from God. And when God speaks, that's final. So this interpretation is sure because God is the one interpreting it, not Daniel. Daniel does a great job of showing us how to declare truth by giving credit to the one who is the truth. Let's read verses 46 and 47. Because Daniel just gave this king, this ruthless king, kind of some bad news. He gave him some good news like, hey, you're the head of gold on this statue. Oh, if I stopped listening there, that's wonderful. Then he keeps going and he keeps saying things like, there's going to be kingdoms that are inferior to yours. Okay, that's good news, right? But then he delivers the final blow and he says, there's this stone that's going to be coming that's going to destroy all of you and you're never going to have any power ever again. That's in the face of this ruthless king. Let's see what the king responds with in verse 46 and 47. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face and paid homage to Daniel and commanded that an offering and incense be offered up to him. The king answered and said to Daniel, truly, your God is God of gods and Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery. So what happens here? What we see is not a reaction from someone ruthless. What we see is that the Lord was at work with how he interpreted, with how he got that information about his kingdom. And what we see is that Nebuchadnezzar is impressed. He acknowledged Daniel. He offered praise to him. It says that he fell on his face and he paid homage. This was a very impressive act for Nebuchadnezzar because he was that ruthless, prideful world ruler. He was not accustomed to bowing or giving any recognition to any fellow man. That's how he got in that position. It's all about me. No one else has anything they can do. I'm the king. I'm important. I'm not going to tell you that you're important. That was his style. But what we see is something out of character up to this point. Here he is, the king, showing honor and respect to a foreign slave who only a little bit ago said he was going to put to death because he was so frustrated. But now he's paying homage to this Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar only knew how to worship physical things, idols, statues, things like that. But now he's paying homage to Daniel, a physical thing, but it was another man. So we see he's still caught in the ways of worshiping physical things, but he's growing in the sense that he realizes that it's not all about me. He acknowledges that God was superior to other gods. This is not a final proclamation of Nebuchadnezzar realizing that it's the one true God, but it's growth. So often we get stuck by having these expectations on people that if you see something miraculous like Daniel interpreting a dream detail by detail and it could only be God, we expect that person's reaction to abandon everything about their life and only turn to the one true God. We don't see that. We don't usually see that in life either. It's this growth process. Nebuchadnezzar shows growth here. He says, your God is superior to all the other gods. There's recognition there. He also says that God is supreme over man and kingdoms. Do you realize what he just said when he says, and he's Lord of kings? Nebuchadnezzar's a king, right? What did he just acknowledge? Is he the greatest in the world? No. He's recognizing now. There's this softening of his heart through this process. We're going to see him backpedal, but we're starting to see him acknowledge more and more outside of himself and say, there's a bigger picture here. Your God is above all. He also acknowledges that God is responsible. He says, because Daniel has been able to reveal this mystery, it must come from your God. So he's starting to recognize that God has power and involvement in his creation. We're going to pause there about talking about Nebuchadnezzar, and I want you to keep an eye as we keep studying Daniel, his growth and his acknowledgement of the one true God.